For years, Harley-Davidson believed loyalty would protect it. The sound, the badge, and the history were supposed to keep riders coming back as the market around them changed. But while Harley leaned on the legend, Honda quietly built a different kind of bond with riders. It gave them motorcycles that felt easier to live with, easier to trust, and easier to keep on the road without making ownership feel like a fight. That is where the danger started. Harley was not beaten in one loud moment or one bad year. It was slowly surrounded by riders who found another path, got comfortable there, and never looked back. Stay until the end, because the real danger for Harley is not just Honda's next motorcycle. It is the years of riders Honda already pulled into its world, the lie everyone believed. Most people still believe Honda won by building better motorcycles than Harley. That is not what happened. The real plan was simpler and harder to see. Honda stopped fighting for the same rider and started building for the rider Harley never reached. While one company protected identity, the other expanded access. That shift sounds small, but it changes everything over time. Instead of competing for the same wallet, Honda created new riders, then kept them. That is the part many riders missed, while the market quietly moved under their feet. Look at what happens when a brand focuses on who is already loyal. It builds deeper connection, but it also builds walls. Those walls feel like strength until new riders walk right past them. Honda never tried to break those walls. It simply built roads around them. That meant more first-time buyers, more second bikes, and more miles being logged on machines that asked less from the rider. Over years, that turns into momentum that does not show up in one season, but shows up across decades. A different kind of pressure starts forming once that momentum builds. It does not look like a fight. The riders who would have eventually stepped into Harley dealerships simply never arrive. They are already somewhere else, riding, learning, and staying. That is how a market shifts without a single dramatic moment. Once that shift settles in, the truth becomes harder to ignore. A pattern like that does not stay hidden forever. And once you start seeing it, everything else begins to make more sense. What Harley was really selling. Harley was never just selling motorcycles. It was selling something harder to measure and easier to feel. The sound of a V-twin rolling through town. The presence that came with a big touring bike pulling up at a gas stop. The sense that you were part of something older than the road you were riding. That identity carried weight for decades, and for a long time, it was enough to hold the market in place. That approach works when the buyer is chasing meaning as much as function. Riders were not just buying transportation. They were buying a statement. The machine mattered, but what it represented mattered more. That kind of pull is powerful, but it depends on something staying constant. It depends on the next generation wanting the same identity the last one did. Once that begins to shift, the whole system starts to loosen. There is a point where usage begins to matter more than image. When riders start thinking about how often they ride, how far they go, and how much effort it takes to keep the bike ready, that is where identity alone starts losing ground. Not because it disappears, but because it stops being enough by itself. The decision changes from what feels right to what works better over time. That is where the gap begins to open. And once it opens, another approach starts to fill it without needing to make any noise. If this lines up with what you've been seeing out there, take a second to like the video, subscribe for more straight answers like this, and share your own experience below. Because real rider insight is what keeps these conversations honest. What Honda focused on instead. Honda took a different path, and it was not built around image at all. It was built around what happens after you leave the dealership and start putting miles on the bike. The focus stayed on repeat riding, predictable behavior, and machines that did not demand attention every time you planned a trip. Not louder, not flashier, just more consistent when it mattered most. That kind of design does not stand out on a showroom floor. It shows up later, on long weekends and extended rides, when the bike starts every time and runs the same way it did the day before. It shows up when maintenance feels routine instead of disruptive. Over time, that builds a different kind of confidence. Not excitement in the moment, but trust that grows quietly with every mile. Riders notice that difference without needing to talk about it. They feel it in how often they ride, and how rarely something goes wrong. They start choosing routes instead of worrying about reliability. That changes how a bike fits into their life. It becomes something they use more often, not something they prepare for. And when that becomes normal, it reshapes expectations. Once expectations shift, the comparison changes too, and what used to matter most starts taking a back seat to what works every time you turn the key. When the center of the market moved, the market did not collapse. It moved. That is the part that catches people off guard. There was no single moment where everything changed. Instead, more riders began choosing machines that fit their daily reality. Fewer were chasing identity first. More were thinking about how often they would ride, how far they would go, and how little friction they wanted between them and the road. That shift builds slowly, and that is why it is easy to miss while it is happening. One rider chooses a practical bike over a statement. Then another does the same. Over time, that becomes a pattern. The center of the market moves without needing an announcement. It simply settles somewhere new, and everything around it adjusts. Once that new center takes hold, older assumptions stop working. Bikes designed for a different priority begin to feel out of place, not because they are bad machines, but because they are built for a version of the rider that is no longer the majority. The gap between what is offered and what is needed becomes more visible with every passing year. That quiet movement is what set everything else in motion. And once it took hold, there was no pulling it back to where it started. Reliability shows up after the sale. Nobody feels reliability on day one. It shows up months later, when the excitement fades and the routine begins. That is where the real difference starts to separate riders. One bike becomes something you trust without thinking. The other becomes something you listen to a little too closely every time you start it. Not because it always fails, but because it feels like it might. That small shift in confidence changes how often you ride and how far you are willing to go without second-guessing the machine under you. Over time, those small moments add up. Fewer unexpected stops, fewer calls to check on parts, fewer weekends spent waiting instead of riding. Riders begin to notice which bikes keep showing up ready and which ones slowly demand more attention. It is not dramatic, and that is exactly why it matters. The difference builds quietly, ride after ride, until it becomes part of how a rider makes decisions without even realizing it. That kind of trust is not built in a brochure. It is built in miles that go by without interruption. Once that trust settles in, riders stop asking whether the bike will make it. They start planning farther, riding longer, and relying on the machine in ways that go beyond a simple weekend loop. That is where loyalty starts to shift without anyone announcing it out loud. And once trust becomes routine, the next thing riders begin to notice is how the bike feels after those long miles are behind them. The miles that wear you down. There is a point on every long ride where the road stops being the challenge and the machine starts to speak louder. Not in noise, but in how it carries itself over distance. Some bikes stay steady, predictable, and composed no matter how many hours pass. Others slowly begin to wear on you. Not enough to stop riding, but enough to make you feel it when you finally step off. That difference does not show up in a spec sheet. It shows up in your body after the ride is done. Riders who spend real time on the road understand this without needing to explain it. You finish a day of riding and either feel ready to go again or feel like you have had enough. That line is subtle, but it shapes how often you ride and how far you are willing to push. Predictability matters here more than anything else. Knowing how the bike will respond, mile after mile, reduces the mental effort required to stay comfortable and in control. When a machine feels the same at the end of a long stretch as it did at the beginning, it builds a kind of quiet respect. Riders stop thinking about the bike and focus entirely on the ride itself. That is where distance becomes less of a concern. Not because the road gets shorter, but because the effort to cover it feels smaller. Once that feeling becomes familiar, it starts influencing another part of ownership that riders notice over time, whether they track it or not. The cost that builds. Over time, The price you see on the floor is only the beginning. What really matters shows up later, spread across months and years of ownership. Maintenance visits that come sooner than expected. Parts that take longer to arrive than they should. Time spent waiting instead of riding. These are the costs that do not show up on paper, but every rider feels them eventually. Not all at once, but often enough to become part of the experience. Money is only part of it. Time carries just as much weight. A weekend lost to a delayed repair is not just an inconvenience. It is a ride that never happened, a trip that gets pushed back or shortened. Those moments accumulate in a way that changes how a rider values the machine. It is no longer just about what the bike can do, but about how consistently it allows you to do it. Over time, patterns become clear. Some bikes demand attention more often, and others simply keep going. Riders begin to factor that into every decision, even if they do not say it directly. The value of a machine becomes tied to how little it interrupts the reason you bought it in the first place. That is where the idea of cost expands beyond dollars and into experience. And when experience starts to take priority, the place where riders feel that shift most clearly is not on the road, but where they go to keep the bike running. What actually happens at the dealership? Step into a dealership, and the difference becomes harder to ignore. Not in the way things are presented, but in how things move behind the scenes. Some shops run like a steady system. Parts arrive when expected. Service timelines stay predictable. Bikes come in, get worked on, and head back out without sitting longer than necessary. Other places feel slower, more uncertain. Delays stretch out. Communication becomes less clear. Bikes wait their turn longer than riders would like. You hear it in conversations without anyone needing to spell it out. Riders talking about how long they waited. Mechanics explaining what is on back order. Sales staff working harder to move inventory that is not turning over as quickly as it used to. None of this happens overnight. It builds gradually, just like everything else in the market. But once it reaches a certain point, it becomes visible to anyone paying attention. Inventory tells its own story as well. Rows of bikes that stay in place longer than expected. Discounts that start appearing where they were not needed before. That is not panic. It is pressure showing up in a form riders can actually see. The kind that reflects what is happening beyond the showroom floor and into the wider market. Once that pressure becomes part of the environment, it connects all the pieces together in a way that is difficult to ignore. Who's still walking into showrooms? Walk into a showroom today, and the shift is not hard to see. The riders browsing the floor tend to look familiar, not new. Many have been riding for decades, and they know exactly what they want. That kind of experience brings confidence, but it also brings a limit. There are fewer new faces replacing the ones stepping back. That is not speculation. It shows up in who is asking questions, who is signing paperwork, and who is not there at all. This change did not happen overnight. It built slowly as fewer, younger riders stepped into the same path. Some chose different types of bikes. Others never entered the market at all. Over time, that gap widened. The riders who once moved up through the ranks are no longer being replaced at the same pace. That creates a quiet imbalance that becomes harder to correct the longer it goes on. Dealers feel this before anyone else does. They see the same patterns repeat. Fewer first-time buyers asking about larger touring machines. More hesitation from those who would have made the jump years ago. That does not mean interest in riding is gone. It means the entry point has changed, and the path forward looks different than it once did. Once that shift becomes visible, another question starts to form about why the products meant to fill that gap never quite lined up with what riders were actually looking for. If you want more breakdowns that cut through the noise and focus on what actually matters to riders, make sure you're subscribed, because the next story goes even deeper into what's changing and what it means before it fully shows up. Timing that didn't line up. It is not accurate to say Harley did nothing. Efforts were made to adjust, and new models were introduced to reach a different kind of rider. The problem was not effort, it was timing and alignment. By the time certain bikes arrived, the market had already moved past the moment they were meant to capture. Riders who might have considered them had already committed elsewhere, building habits and preferences that are hard to reverse. Price played a role as well. When a new direction is introduced, it needs to meet riders where they are, not where they used to be. If the cost feels out of step with what is being offered, hesitation sets in quickly. Riders begin comparing not just features, but value over time. That is where decisions shift, often quietly, without much discussion. There is also the question of what riders actually wanted at that moment. Not what they used to want, and not what was expected, but what fit their current riding life. When a product misses that mark, even slightly, it struggles to gain traction. That is especially true in a market where alternatives are already available and proven. As these mismatches accumulate, they begin shaping where riders go next, and that path often starts much earlier than many people realize. Where riders actually start now. The first bike a rider chooses has more influence than most people admit. It sets expectations, builds habits, and defines what feels normal on the road. Once that foundation is established, the next decision becomes easier, not harder. Riders tend to stay within what they know, moving forward without needing to start over. That is how long-term loyalty forms, without needing to be forced. When that first step happens outside of Harley, the path naturally continues in a different direction, not because of rejection, but because of familiarity. Riders grow comfortable with what they have learned, and they build confidence in a system that already works for them. Changing that later requires more than interest. It requires a reason strong enough to break that comfort. This is where entry-level access matters more than it appears. If the first experience feels right, it creates momentum that carries forward. Riders upgrade within the same ecosystem, choosing what fits their next stage without leaving behind what they already trust. Over time, that creates a steady flow that builds quietly, without drawing attention to itself. That flow becomes more powerful as it continues, eventually shaping not just individual choices, but how entire brands are perceived over the long run. When identity stops carrying the weight. Identity once carried the decision. It was enough to draw riders in and keep them there. That kind of pull does not disappear, but it changes as the market evolves. What once felt like an open invitation can begin to feel more like a narrow path. Not intentionally, but as a result of staying too closely tied to a single image of what a rider should be. As expectations shift, that image can start filtering out riders who do not see themselves in it. Not because they reject it, but because it does not match how they ride or what they need. The same identity that once attracted a wide range of people becomes more selective over time. That is not always visible at first, but it becomes clearer as fewer new riders step into that space. Meanwhile, other approaches feel more flexible. They adapt to different riding styles and different expectations without requiring riders to fit a specific mold. That creates a contrast that grows stronger over time. One side remains defined and consistent. The other expands and adjusts to meet a wider range of needs. That difference shapes how the market continues to evolve, setting the stage for consequences that extend far beyond individual buying decisions. The blueprint others are following. Look closely at the wider market, and a pattern begins to stand out. Other manufacturers are no longer experimenting in different directions. They are aligning around a shared understanding of what works. The focus has shifted toward machines that keep riders moving with fewer interruptions, that welcome more people into the saddle, and that make ownership feel manageable over time. That approach is no longer unique. It is becoming the standard others are building toward. This is not something driven by marketing language. It shows up in the bikes themselves and in how they are positioned. You see it in how different brands present their lineups, offering options that meet riders at different stages without asking them to change how they ride. The emphasis is not on one identity, but on making sure there is always a place for someone to step in and stay. That creates a steady flow that is difficult to disrupt once it is established. Riders pick up on this without needing to analyze it. They see more choices that feel usable, more machines that fit their everyday riding habits, and fewer barriers to getting started or moving up. That builds a kind of quiet agreement across the industry. The direction becomes clearer, and once enough companies move the same way, it reinforces itself. With that alignment in place, the pressure does not stay contained within design or marketing. It begins to show up in the one place riders notice immediately. Pressure shows up in pricing. Walk through a dealership, and the signs are easier to read than any report. Prices that once held firm begin to soften. Discounts appear where they were not needed before. Incentives start showing up to keep bikes moving off the floor. None of this happens without a reason. It reflects a shift in how quickly machines are selling and how much effort it takes to close a deal. This is not about a sudden collapse. It is a gradual tightening that builds over time. Sales take longer. Inventory stays in place longer than expected. Dealers begin adjusting to keep things moving, not because they want to, but because they have to. That is where the balance between price and demand becomes visible to anyone paying attention. Riders feel this shift directly. It changes how they approach a purchase. When movement slows, it creates room to negotiate. When incentives appear, it signals that the market is no longer operating the way it once did. That does not mean the product has lost value. It means the environment around it has changed, and pricing is responding to that reality. Once pricing begins to adjust, it connects back to how those machines are built and supported, and that is where the strain becomes harder to ignore. The cost of holding the old model. Maintaining a higher price point while volume slows creates pressure that reaches deep into how a company operates. It affects how bikes are produced, how resources are allocated, and how expectations are managed across the entire system. When fewer units are moving, each one carries more weight. That makes it harder to sustain the same structure without adjustments somewhere along the line. This is not about one decision or one moment. It is about a model that becomes more difficult to maintain under changing conditions. Costs remain, but the flow of sales shifts. That creates tension between what needs to be sustained and what the market is willing to support. Over time, that tension forces choices that were not necessary before. Riders may not see every detail behind the scenes, but they feel the results. It shows up in pricing, in availability, and in how the brand positions itself moving forward. The gap between what worked in the past and what works now becomes more visible as these pressures build. As those pressures settle in, they point toward a deeper change that goes beyond any single brand or strategy. What actually changed? At the center of everything is a shift that did not happen all at once. It unfolded over years, shaped by how riders use their bikes and what they expect from them. The focus moved from what a machine represents to what it delivers over time. That does not erase identity, but it changes its role in the decision. Function begins to carry more weight than image, and consistency becomes more valuable than presence alone. This is not about one company losing and another winning in a simple sense. It is about how priorities evolve as the market matures. Riders look for machines that fit their routines, that support how often they ride, and that require less from them in return. That expectation reshapes what matters, and once it settles in, it becomes the new baseline. You can see it in how choices are made today. The decision starts with how a bike will be used, not just how it feels in the moment. That does not remove emotion from riding. It places it alongside practicality instead of above it. Over time, that balance becomes the defining factor. Honda did not beat Harley-Davidson with one headline, one model, or one lucky year. It did it by understanding something riders feel every time they turn the key. Trust keeps people riding. Harley's legend still matters. But the road has changed, and Honda followed the rider before the rider followed the badge. If this story hits close, like the video, subscribe for more honest motorcycle breakdowns, and tell us in the comments where you think Harley goes next.